Hi everyone, welcome back to the audit and attestation class. In this class, we'll be understanding in detail about non-audit engagement. So let's dive into. Now we are jumping into non-audit engagement. Non-audit engagement follow SARs and SSAEs, right? So non-audit engagement include preparation engagement, compilation engagement, review engagement, and
attestation
engagement. So here we need to follow SARs and SSAEs, right? Accountant should consider the following before accepting any non-audit engagement. Non-audit engagement, preparation, compilation, review, and attestation engagement. First thing is ethical requirement regarding professional competency will be satisfied. That means you are independent to the code of conduct and code of ethics of the firm policy is being adhered before accepting any non-audit engagement. So in non-audit engagement, for preparation engagement or compilation engagement, independence is not mandatory, but for review engagement and attestation engagement, independence is mandatory, right? Second is financial reporting framework selected by the management should be acceptable. That means they should not be accepting any like cash basis of accounting or any accounting framework which is not acceptable in the US, right? So they should be following either US GAAP or IFRS or any special reporting framework required by the respective regulatory authority. They should not be considering any other reporting framework, right? So that's something we need to evaluate before accepting the engagement. Third is obtaining the agreement with the management responsibility. So again, management responsibility is also very critical thing whether you are accepting any audit engagement or non-audit engagement. What is the management responsibility? Selection of financial reporting framework for the review engagement, attestation, compilation, or preparation engagement, right? So framework, reporting frameworks selection is always be the management responsibility. Design, implementation, and maintenance of internal control is also management responsibility. Appropriate disclosure in accordance with the acceptable financial reporting framework is also being the management responsibility. So there might be a scenario where management will ask not to disclose certain thing which is required as per the required accounting standard or financial reporting framework. So in that case of scenario, you need to evaluate whether you want to accept that engagement or not to accept that engagement, and whether the reason for not giving the disclosure is legitimate or not legitimate. D is preventing and detecting fraud is also being a management responsibility. Ensuring the entity comply with the law and regulation is also management responsibility. Accuracy and completeness of the report provided for the preparation of financial statement is also the management responsibility. So these all management responsibility need to be clearly laid down and communicated to the management before accepting even any non-audit engagement, right? And then fourth is unrestricted access to the information and personnel.
Anji Gaganji.
Yes, Gurmehar.
Gaganji se baat kar raha hai.
Okay. Next is not required or not mandatory to communicate with the predecessor auditor. So for non-audit service, it's not mandatory to communicate with the predecessor auditor, right? Accountant in connection with the compilation and review engagement. Under few circumstances, under some circumstances, it is beneficial to obtain the information from predecessor auditor, but for non-audit service, it is not mandatory. So like when it is being beneficial to have a communication with the predecessor auditor for any special item of the attention, any disagreement, right, any complex accounting matter or change that take place after the end of the accounting year, right, or frequent change in accounting. So if, for example, management is changing CPA year over year, so what is the reason? So to obtain more understanding about those areas, it is good, but it is not mandatory.
कॉफी पी ली, गन्ने का रस पी लिया, वो पीनट्स खा लिया.
भाई दो इधर भी भेज दे.
गुरमेहर भूख लग रही है.
हाँ इधर भी भेज दो सब।
मैं अनम्यूट म्यूट हो रखा था।
देख लो।
हाँ यार मैं तो सोच रहा हूँ, और तू गन्ने के जूस के साथ कौन से पीनट्स खा रहा है भाई?
अरे नहीं, एक्चुअल में सुबह क्रिकेट खेलने गया था, तो वापसी में पहले गन्ने का रस पिया, अब फिर घर आके कोल्ड कॉफी भी पी ली, फिर पीनट्स भी खा लिए, अब भूख ही नहीं लग रही, तो पूछते कि कुछ खाना है, मैंने कहा नहीं अभी भूख नहीं है।
Okay, 30 more minutes. 30 more minutes. Have patience with me. We are about to finish for today. Just 30 more minutes. Okay, next is specific management representation for compilation engagement. So whenever you are conducting any compilation engagement, so you need to take certain representation from the management for the compilation engagement. First is obtain an agreement of management, that is called engagement letter, which is very much mandatory, that it acknowledge and understand its responsibility. So an engagement letter for the compilation engagement should have a statement saying the management acknowledge and understand their responsibility for the preparation and fair presentation of the financial statement. An accountant compilation report should mention that accountant has performed the compilation only. They have not conducted any audit or review. So that is need to be clearly laid down in a compilation engagement, right?
In the compilation agreement, we don't have any risk involved in it, no? Sir, in the compilation engagement, we don't have any risk involved in it, right?
Yes, yes. So whatever the management is providing you information, you are considering that management has provided you fair representation of the information, right? And you are just conducting a compilation. That means you are preparing a balance sheet, profit and loss account, cash flow statement, notes to account, and other disclosure based on the information provided by the management. That is called compilation engagement. And on that you are giving your compilation report. In that report, you will be clearly mentioning that you have not conducted any review or audit, and hence you are not giving any opinion, right?
Okay.
Scope limitation. If accountant is not satisfied with the precondition and the management cannot make satisfactory change, then accountant should not accept that engagement. If you are not comfortable with when you perform like acceptance and continuance procedure, and you are not comfortable in accepting any engagement, and management is also not making those changes which make you feel comfortable to accept that engagement, then in that case of scenario you should not accept that engagement, right? So now coming to the review engagement. So for non-audit engagement we have understand at high level. Now let's come to the point by point review engagement, then we will be discussing attestation engagement and compilation engagement and all that stuff, right? So first is review engagement. You need to follow SARS, right? Do not accept the engagement if management or those charged with governance impose the limitation on the scope and accountant is unable to perform the review. If you are not able to perform the review procedure because of the scope limitation imposed by the management, then you should not be accepting that engagement, right? Before accepting any review engagement, accountant should obtain the agreement of management that it acknowledge and understand their responsibility that comes under the engagement letter. So we'll be discussing in detail what all things you need to consider when you are drafting the engagement letter. So that we have a detailed session on that, but here just high level understand what all things are mandatory, right? So what all things are recommendatory and what all things ideally should be in engagement letter, we'll be discussing in detail. But as of now, we are keeping those things which are mandatory for the respective engagement letter. So first one is preparation and fair presentation of financial statement. Second is to provide the letter of representation upon conclusion of the review. So this is also mandatory procedure. This is also mandatory requirement that management will be providing a management representation letter upon conclusion of the review, upon completion of the review engagement, right? And accountant review report should include the reviewed financial statement should include the accountant review report wherever management is distributing the unaudited financial statement or reviewed financial statement, right? So this confirmation also you'll be taking from the management, that wherever you are distributing the unaudited financial statement or reviewed financial statement, you'll be mandatorily attaching the review report to that. Next is attestation engagement. We need to follow SSAEs, right? So example for attestation engagement, like research and development expenditure, if you need to give any certification for that, any tax credit certification, turnover certification, compliance certification, right? So those all comes under the attestation engagement. So in attestation engagement, accountant must comply with the professional code of conduct, obtain an acknowledgement of the management responsibility on the subject matter to attest, which the auditor is supposed to attest, right? So, and lastly, clarifying, clearly define the criteria to measure. So here, when you are taking an attestation engagement, which is like kind of agreed upon procedure or examination engagement, in that, what all things you need to examine is also need to be clearly laid down in the engagement letters, right? So this is all about, you can say, acceptance and continuous of audit engagement and non-audit engagement. And here, what I have done, I have summarized the requirements and comparison of compilation engagement, review engagement, and audit engagement, so that at one page you have a glance what is being required for the respective category of engagement. So here, level of assurance. In the compilation engagement, you will not give any assurance, right? In the review engagement, you give limited assurance. For audit engagement, you provide reasonable assurance, right? Makes sense? Second is knowledge of the client industry. So when the knowledge of client industry is being required, mandatory requirement. Understanding of the applicable financial reporting framework and the significant accounting policy intended to be used in preparation of the financial statement is only required in the compilation engagement. So no industry knowledge is very much mandatory required for the compilation engagement. So far you have understanding of the accounting standard and financial reporting framework in which you need to provide the compilation services, right? Review engagement. To perform the review engagement, the accountant should possess or obtain an understanding of industry. So for review engagement, it is being required, right? And which entity operate, including accounting policy, principle, and reporting framework. And extensive knowledge is required when you are conducting audit. So you should have an understanding of the respective industry to conduct the review engagement, but extensive knowledge is required to conduct the audit of the respective relevant industry. Coming to the third point, which is inquiry procedures are required. So for compilation engagement, not required, right? For compilation engagement, not required, but in review engagement, inquiry and analytical procedures are required, right? And in audit, do you perform inquiry and analytical procedure? The answer is yes, right? In audit also, you require inquiry and analytical procedure.
Audit में तो सारे ही factors involve हो जाएंगे ना?
Yes, absolutely.
Test of details से लेके सब कुछ की risk involve है नहीं है, सब कुछ सारे factors involve होते हैं.
So fourth one is omit disclosure. For example, management is omitting any required disclosure, or management do not want to give disclosure of any particular item, right? So how do you deal with in compilation engagement? Inadequate disclosure require modification on the standard compilation report, right? Although accepting an engagement, substantially omit all the disclosure are allowed, right? In the compilation engagement, you can accept the engagement with less disclosure, but you need to modify the opinion. Inadequate disclosure require modification in the standard review report. So in review report also you can provide, but you need to provide the modified report, right? And inadequate disclosure required a qualified opinion or adverse opinion, right? In case of audit. Next, if there is material departure from the GAAP or applicable financial reporting framework. So material departure from GAAP or applicable reporting framework require modification. That means in compilation report, you will be mentioning that the compilation is being not conducted in line with the reporting framework. And if there is a material departure from the GAAP, that require a modification in the standard review report. So review report also require modification. And in case of audit, you need to assess whether you need to qualify if it has a significant impact, and if the impact is severe and persuasive, then the adverse opinion will be issued, right?
Omitted disclosures hota kya basically?
That means you are not giving any disclosure. For example, the company has asked you not to prepare cash flow statement, right? Which is requirement of the GAAP reporting framework, right? So for example, they will ask you not to disclose related party disclosure. So that is called omission of the disclosure, required disclosure. Last is accountant independence. So accountant independence is not required for the compilation, right? Right, this is all we have studied, but in review it is required, and in audit it is required, right?
The compilation में last में लिखा हुआ report must be modified to state that accountant is not.
Yes. So in compilation report, you are allowed not to be independent, but if you are not independent, then it is mandatory for you to mention in your report that you are not independent.
Okay.
Right. So this is a quick summary for your ready reference. Now we are jumping into the last topic of the day, which is terms of engagement and engagement letter. What all things you need to consider in the respective engagement letter. I tried to beautifully summarize in this 1.5 pages. A lot of content in different books and curriculum. So I have taken a reference from many books to summarize this, and I'm sure this will answer all your questions relating to terms of engagement and engagement letter for any category of engagement, whether it's an audit engagement, review engagement, preparation, compilation, or attestation engagement. So what all things you need to keep in mind for in the engagement letter? First is objective and scope of engagement. That is required in all the engagement letter, whether it's an audit engagement, review engagement, preparation engagement, compilation, or attestation engagement. Again is auditor responsibility. That is also mandatorily required in all engagement letter. Management responsibility is also required in all engagement letter. Statement of inherent limitation. So if there is any limitation in the scope from the management side, then that limitation is also required to be mentioned in the engagement letter when you are considered to accept that engagement, right? But you still need to have that in the written management engagement letter. Next is financial reporting framework, whether you are following US GAAP, IFRS, or any governmental accounting standard framework. So you need to mention that mandatorily in the engagement letter. Next is expected form and content of those report to be issued. So in which form? For example, sometimes you need to give a certification to the government or department. So you have a specified form in which that report is required. So in which form and content that specific report is being required and expected from the auditor, that also need to be mentioned in the engagement letter, Next is change in the terms without reasonable justification. So that applies only to the audit engagement. If initially you have been appointed as an auditor, but later on your role has been changed to review or to the compilation engagement. So in that case of scenario, when you are changing the engagement and you are accepting that engagement because of justified reason, then in that new engagement letter, you will be mentioning the reason for that, right? Next is agreement regarding the planning and performance. So when you are conducting that audit, review engagement, compilation engagement, and what all things you'll be doing. So those agreements and scope of work need to be clearly laid down at the in the engagement letter as well. Next is expected that management will provide the written representation. This is also mandatory procedure for audit, review, compilation, and attestation. But in preparation, the representation letter is not mandatory, it's an optional, right? Next is 11th point, management to make available draft financial statement. So except the preparation or compilation engagement, so for the review engagement and audit engagement, it's being a management responsibility to provide the financial statement, right? But in review or in compilation or in preparation, it's not required. And in attestation engagement or agreed upon procedure, entire financial statement is not required.
Sir, what was the difference in preparation and compilation?
In preparation engagement, you are just preparing the financial statement, but in compilation, you are giving the report as well in addition to preparation.
Oh.
12th is inform subsequent event to the auditor. So that is required in audit engagement, not required in any other engagement. Fee and billing arrangement. So how much is the total fees for the respective engagement and how the auditor will be billing it and what is the terms of payment is also required to be mentioned in the engagement letter. Then sign off engagement letter is also being required by both the parties, auditor as well as the client. Next is involvement of other auditor and specialist. So in case of audit engagement or examination engagement, if it is required to involve third-party specialist, right? Any tax specialist, any lawyer, then you need to mention that also in the engagement letter. Because in review engagement, it is not required. Compilation and preparation, it is not required. But in attestation, if you need to attest, let's say, research and development expenditure, but you are not expert in certain terminologies or in certain research areas, right? In that case of scenario, you'll be involving, let's say, any engineer or any scientist. So in that case of scenario, it has to be mentioned in the engagement letter. Next is involvement of internal auditor or other staff, if any. So that is also for audit engagement or attestation engagement. Review, compilation, and preparation, no internal auditor are requirements. So if you are involving internal auditor for audit engagement or attestation engagement, you need to mention that in the engagement letter. So what all things you what is your strategy for involving the internal auditor or the staff of the internal audit team? Next is arrangement with the predecessor auditor if applicable, right? So that also need to be mentioned in audit engagement or attestation engagement. Any restriction to the auditor, that also required to be mentioned in audit engagement letter. Any obligation on the auditor, it also required to be mentioned in engagement letter for the audit. Additional services you will be providing in addition to audit, like non-audit services, right, which require pre-approval of the audit committee. All those additional services provided by the auditor is also need to be mentioned in the engagement letter. Or any reference to further agreement is also required to be mentioned. Address to the client and signed by both the parties is also required in all kind of engagement letter, like we discussed earlier also. Statement of no assurance if needed. So if you are not providing any assurance, then it is being mandatorily need to be add in the audit or review engagement where you are supposed to provide any assurance. If you are not providing assurance, then you need to mention in the engagement letter and the reason for that also. Limitation of preparation and compilation So that is required in preparation and compilation engagement. For example, like management says, we do not require to give all the disclosures. So you only need to prepare balance sheet, profit and loss account. So there is a scope limitation that you need to be mentioned in the engagement letter for the preparation and compilation engagement.
But फिर ये compilation में भी assurance नहीं देते ना हम तो?
No.
So okay, statement
so
of
वहाँ
no
तो देते ही नहीं है, because we do not give assurance in compilation and preparation, then it's not at all required. But in audit and review, we give limited assurance and reasonable assurance. But if you are not giving assurance, even after performing the review procedure and limited procedure, that you need to mention the reason for the same in engagement letter.
That will only be in the case of preparation. We have just prepared.
No. When you provide assurance for limited review, the limited assurance. For audit, you provide reasonable assurance. In examination, you provide reasonable assurance, right? So in these three cases of scenario, if you are not providing assurance, then you need to mention that in engagement letter and the reason why you are not providing assurance.
Okay.
For preparation and compilation, any which ways you are not providing assurance. That is like not required to provide any assurance. But in these three kind of engagement, you are supposed to provide assurance. And if you are not providing assurance, then you need to mention in the engagement letter along with the reason why you are not providing the assurance. 25th, material departure from the reporting framework. If there is a material departure from the reporting framework, then whether you are performing any preparation engagement, review engagement, compilation engagement, attestation engagement, or audit engagement, you need to mandatorily mention in the engagement letter. Next is election or omission. Election or omission of any disclosure by the management. So in the preparation engagement, you need to mention in the engagement letter. But for audit and review, you can qualify the report if there is any omission which is required to be there. Subject matter and attestation, subject matter and assertion to attestation. So that is only required for the attestation engagement, right? Applicable criteria to be used for the management evaluation and disclosure of subject matter. So that is for agreed upon procedure. Not EVP, should be AUP. So that's required in the attestation engagement. You need to mention in the engagement letter for the attestation engagement. Restricted use of report. So in attestation engagement are generally for the limited use or only for the restricted use for any particular authority and for the management or for the respective stakeholder. So you need to mention the restriction of the use in the engagement letter for the attestation engagement. Acknowledgement of sufficiency of the procedure. That is also like procedure you need to lay down in the engagement letter for attestation engagement or examination engagement. What all procedure you are supposed to perform, right? That also you need to mention in the engagement letter for the attestation engagement. 31st, review is substantially less in scope than examination procedure. So in attestation engagement, when you are performing the review procedure, you need to specifically mention this line that review procedure are substantially less than the examination procedure. Hence, we will be providing the limited assurance. Last one, agreed upon procedure and the materiality for those procedures need to be mentioned in the attestation engagement, right? So this is all required in the respective engagement letter. Does that make sense? Any doubt? Anything need more clarification? You feel this table will be helpful?
Yes, sir.
मैंने जो point 23 discuss करा था ना, जो I asked the question as well, statement of no assurance. I am still confused in it क्योंकि उसमें आपने टिक जो मारा है वो preparation के नीचे मारा, तो वो compilation के नीचे भी आएगा ना? Yeah, I'm getting it wrong still.
No, you are getting it wrong. So
okay.
You are saying statement of no assurance if needed. statement of no assurance if needed for preparation engagement
सर ये तो
in the
इनफैक्ट
engagement.
बाकियों के लिए होगा ना टिक, क्योंकि अगर हम नो इंश्योरेंस दे रहे हैं तो सब में जाएगा, ऑडिट में भी जाएगा, रिव्यू में भी जाएगा,
इसमें नहीं आना चाहिए, कंपाइलेशन
इनमें
और
क्रॉस होना चाहिए।
प्रिपरेशन और कंपाइलेशन दोनों में क्रॉस होना चाहिए सपोज।
Yes. इन दोनों में yes. Oops. I think in compilation also it will come. Yes.
सर ये कंपाइलेशन और प्रिपरेशन में हम स्टेटमेंट देने की जरूरत नहीं है तो क्रॉस होगा ना, बाकी ऑडिट
स्टेटमेंट देना है, स्टेटमेंट देना है।
और
That-
ऑडिट और रिव्यू और
That compilation engagement and review engagement do not give any assurance. So that we
basically
need
ये
to mention in engagement letter.
प्रिपरेशन और कंपाइलेशन में ऑलरेडी हम एश्योरेंस नहीं देते, तो वी डोंट नीड टू मेक अ सेपरेट डिस्क्लोजर।
No, we
But
need
in
to
a-
mention. We need to mention in the engagement letter that we will not be giving any assurance.
and you are
Okay,
mentioning that in case of audit or review we're not, if we are not giving any assurance, you have to mention that in engagement letter. I don't know whether I heard it wrong, तो ऐसा भी है कुछ?
Which point number?
So इसी में 23rd point में, so if you were saying that अगर हम review और audit engagement या attestation में भी if we are not giving any assurance, then also we have to include that statement that we are not giving any assurance.
No, statement of no assurance is required in the engagement letter of preparation and compilation, because in those we are not giving any assurance.
Okay.
So we need to clearly lay down.
In other aspects, assurance has to be given, either limited or reasonable assurance.
Yes. So I'm not sure on the fairness. Yes. Do you know how this tick mark will come? Or I need to go back to the typewriter? Do you have any idea? Yeah, I'm not able to copy. I don't know how he has.
अच्छा, ये सारा होगा ना?
So I'm getting. Do you know, like there are symbols also.
फॉन्ट मोड वेबडिंग्स करें और ए से टिक मांगा बोल देना आवाज।
Sorry.
एक सेकंड सर, फॉन्ट वेबडिंग्स यूज करो, उसमें ए और आर से टिक और क्रॉस होता है।
Font, which one?
वेबडिंग्स, WEB, हाँ ये वाला,
WEB, this
ये
one.
वाला, या
So इसमें R से हो जाएगा.
आर से क्रॉस आता है, ए से टिक आएगा।
E.
ए
Okay.